So as you know, this is the book we're doing, Delivered into Covenant, Pivotal Moments in the Book of Exodus, Part 2 by Walter Brueggemann. And today we're going over Chapter 2, which has the peppy title, Loaves Abound, ! And the pivotal text that this chapter asks us to consider is found in the 16th chapter, still in the 16th chapter, verses 17 through 21, which reads, "The Israelites did so." The thing that they're doing is they're gathering manna. Some gathering more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, those who gathered much had nothing over, and those who had gathered little had no shortage. They gathered as much as each of them needed. And Moses said to them, "Let no one leave any of it over until morning." But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and became foul. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning, they gathered it as much as each needed. But when the sun grew hot, it melted. As I was saying, this is one of my favorite Bible stories. And at the same time, I've found that preaching about this passage or similar passages, there are several that are related to it, follow a similar theme. I found preaching on these passages frustrating because what I've learned is no one, not even the preacher, me who's preaching the message, can seem to believe it. In short, no one can seem to believe that one, God provides for God's children, and that two, there is enough to go around, and three, that if we are greedy and hoard what we've got, it'll spoil and create more need in the community. And as I say, it's just my experience of people after a sermon like this. No one disputes that Jesus broke bread and fed the multitudes, or that we're asked not to worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will take care of itself, or that stories like this placed back in the Old Testament give us the takeaway is that God will provide even in the wilderness. But we as individuals, alas, continue to live as if we were about to have the rug pulled out from underneath us sometimes, especially in churches when we talk about finance and anxieties about resources. And I think if we really believed this story, we would feel less anxiety. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's turn to the text as presented by Walter Brueggemann. And if you read chapter 16, you'll know the Israelites are sojourning on. They're in the wilderness where we found them last week. And they're in that place. And in that place, they are graced with a mysterious, fine, flaky substance to eat. It's given the name manna, which means what is it? And what is it indeed? We don't in fact know. And the arrival of this food source is given very little airtime or reflection in the biblical narrative. It just sort of happens as they need it. But then the text quickly moves to descriptions of how the Israelites are to receive this gift. And today's passage has everything to do with how they are to handle this miraculous food. And they are to do as follows, basically to sum it up, make it simple. The bread is to be distributed according to need, and no one is to gather any more or less than the need for that given day. So just exactly what you need. And no one is to save any bread as surplus, or to say, I guess, stow some away for a rainy day fund. They are only permitted to gather what they can use on the given day. That's basically it. And this guidance contrasts with the values of Pharaoh's rule, one that, if you recall, hoarded resources, built great grain bins, and had a whole lot in store, but did not distribute those resources as needed to those that needed them. Specifically, the Israelites who worked hard for those resources, but benefited very little by way of those resources. Brueggemann writes, "If the Israelites do hoard the bread, the manna spoils. It grows worms, becomes foul, and melts away. The spoiling of the manna serves as a reminder to the people that the bread given in divine generosity is for all members of the community and just for today. As the narrative unfolds, we will discover that God's providence will continue unabated until the Israelites arrive at the land of promise. The manna ceased," reads Joshua 5:12. "The manna ceased on the day they ate the produce of the land. And the Israelites no longer had manna. They ate the crops of the land of Canaan that year." In other words, until they had crossed the Jordan River and into the promised land, years later, they continued to have this as a reliable food supply in the wilderness. And by the time they arrived at the land of promise, the lessons learned about God and God's ability to provide should have been well learned. They learned through those years that even in the wilderness, or especially the wilderness that appears to fall outside the fruitfulness of creation, well, that place turns out to be a venue presided over by the God of abundance. So as I was saying, they could or should, if they choose, continue to share the resources of their new home in the way they had done with the food from heaven. So they're in a different circumstance when they arrive at the promised land. Before, they had the food gather on the ground, and then they would gather it in the morning as they had needed. But now they have a land of plenty where they have the choice, the option to either hoard and to save, which they could not do with the manna, or to use as needed and distribute to those as had need. And so they can continue these practices. And the hope is that they will, in the promised land, continue to live in the way that they learned to live in the wilderness, trusting on God for providence and making sure that everybody has everything that they need. And the Israelites would, again and again, return to the lessons they learned in the wilderness over the course of centuries. There's a lot of passages, and many of them were listed at the start of this chapter that perhaps you read, that have to do with these themes or remembering this story. When times were hard or when they found themselves displaced by various empires, they would be called to remember the times when God provided water from rocks and food from the sky. But the challenge may have been to remember God's providence during the good times. And I think that all of us can relate to how little we think about a need to pray for our daily bread, or to trust in God to provide when we seem to have all that we need. Indeed, they were warned in their own scriptures to never forget the times of plenty. In the passage, Deuteronomy 8:14-17 reads, this is God talking to the people. Do not exalt yourself, forgetting the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrible wilderness, an arid wasteland with poisonous snakes and scorpions. He made water flow for you from flint rock and fed you in the wilderness with manna that your ancestors did not know, to humble you and to test you, and in the end, to do you good. Brueggemann writes that these texts summon Israel to pay attention to the seductions of self-sufficiency that come with an autonomous economy that no longer remembers that the ground for well-being is not in possessions or surplus, but in gifts given for the entire community. So today we visited with a story that shows that God provides in the wilderness, and then later comes these reminders to always remember that time, so that when you live in the land of plenty, you don't start to behave like Pharaoh and to hoard and to operate from a mindset of scarcity. Brueggemann writes, thus both in exile in Babylon, in the Babylon of Isaiah, and in the land in Deuteronomy, the tradition appeals to the manna narrative and knows that surplus wealth not shared with the community places serious faith in jeopardy, to be replaced by a society of autonomy and self-sufficiency that is unsustainable. And he quotes again from Deuteronomy, do not say to yourself, my power and the might of my own hand have gotten me this wealth, but remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, so that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your ancestors, as he is doing today. And here's a longer quote that ties it right in with the gospel narrative in the life of Jesus. We are meant to see Jesus breaking bread and distributing food as somebody who is living into the same spirit of the God that we encounter in the book of Exodus, providing bread in the wilderness. And of this, Brueggemann writes, the manna narrative is reperformed in the ministry of Jesus. In 2 episodes of the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is remembered as the one who brought abundant bread into venues of scarcity. In Mark 6:31-44, Jesus is in a desert place or wilderness and finds a hungry crowd without resources. And moved by his deep compassion, he takes what little food there is that is available, 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and draws that food into the orbit of his own drama, a drama of abundance. The narrative reports that he took the bread and fish, he blessed them, he broke them, and he gave them. By this gesture, and in his utterance, he multiplied the bread, fed 5,000 men, and had 12 baskets of extra bread. As in the manna story, there's no explanation for this multiplication and no curiosity about it. In the second narrative, Mark 8:1-10, the action of chapter 6 is reiterated. Jesus takes 7 loaves of bread, gives thanks, he breaks and gives the bread. Enough for 4,000 people, and 7 baskets of extra bread are left over. Any knowledgeable Christian will readily notice that the 4 verbs of Jesus's action, took, blessed, broke, gave, and the variant, took, gave thanks, broke, gave, are the 4 wondrous verbs of the Eucharist, the sacrament, named thanks. Through the meal of abundant bread, the church both imagines and receives a society that is grounded in divine abundance. This act defies the scarcity of the wilderness in a way that is beyond explanation, made possible by the magisterial abundance whereby Jesus generates the fruitfulness of creation in places where it surely seemed not possible. And I don't know if you ever, you probably have noticed that before, that the same words that I use at the communion table, or anyone who presides over communion uses at the communion table, are taken from not only the prayer of Jesus that he prayed, and not only the account of the Last Supper, but from these earlier stories where Jesus takes bread, breaks it, and gives it. And so our communion on Sunday ties us in to the community of the Old Testament that found that they had enough in the deserted places. And the communion teaches us dozens and dozens of things, but amongst those things, one of the things it teaches us each and every week, or is meant to teach us each and every week, is that we ought to remember that God will provide. Will provide for our church, will provide for us as individuals, has in the past and will continue to do so. And that we need not have undue anxiety any more than we need to take on about resources in a world that has enough to go around. Brueggemann now turns and asks us to consider the parallels between Pharaoh's economy and our economy, contrasted with the kind of economy that might be envisioned by the Gospels and by the story that we're considering. He writes on page 36, "It takes no imagination to see that our current rapacious economy is a close replication of Pharaoh's old monopoly. Our current economic arrangement for distribution of goods is exactly an enslavement for those who supply cheap labor. The refusal of surplus is an act of dissent from dominant practice." And then towards the end of this chapter, he writes, "This manna narrative, along with its derivative performances, compels us to look with an acutely critical eye at normal economics that are constituted by the distribution of scarce resources. It is an ideology of scarcity that propels ordinary economics, that justifies vast accumulations of goods at the expense of other people, that makes cheap labor permissible and necessary, and that assumes the legitimacy of the great divide between the haves and the have-nots. The manna story, which is the taproot of gospel abundance, refuses such ordinary economics and shows that goods essential to life can be differently distributed. We do not, says the narrative, live in a world of scarcity. That notion is an imposed ideology that legitimates turning neighbors into rivals and threats. We do not reason to the manna story to find it credible. Rather, we reason from it and find it to be the baseline for new thinking and new action, new neighborliness and new social policy, new gratitude and new possibility." And that's it. That's the summarization of the chapter. And so with the rest of our time together, I turn it over to you. What do you think, and what thoughts or reflections have you on the reading or on the biblical text?
First, unmute myself. The Golden Piggy Bank brought memories of one of the channels that Janet likes to watch, the Grit, which shows a lot of old westerns. A lot of the commercials are about buying gold.
Yes.
And And I hear people talk about how they're buying gold, the paper money doesn't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going, this really doesn't equate with my feeling of what my faith is telling me.
I know the commercials you're talking about. They're basically, they stir up a pot of fear. They say, you know, your dollars are not going to be worth much here in a little bit.
Right.
So why don't you buy some gold from us, which will maintain its value? And I always find that funny. Think about it for just a second. They're asking you to exchange your currency, which they're in one breath telling you will soon be worthless, for gold that they're wanting to give you. Which, you think about it, if they believed that, they would just sit on the pile of gold and they would never take your currency.
Right.
If they really believed that it was about to not be worth anything, it's a kind of gimmick. But even let's just buy
like
into
you said they claim that the gold retains its value, but it doesn't. It goes up and down just like anything else.
And you can't eat gold. If the bottom really falls out of the economy, you can't, it's not going to keep you alive. But I think it does, though, tap at the heart of what these stories are meant to steer us away from, which is an idea that, one, there is not enough for us to have. There's not enough to go around in the world. And two, that the answer to that is to hoard and to relegate our resources to piggy banks or silos or bigger purses or bank accounts, and just sort of sit on it as an anxiety about the what ifs in life. And the whole point of the manna going bad after one day is, if a community does that with resources as its general rule, then it will relegate to certain places, and where it's needed to produce life, to sustain life, to feed hungry people, to provide water, shelter, all of those things, it won't go to those places. And so the important lesson of the manna was it taught them to live in such a way that really did trust and rely on the God who created this planet of abundance, to that God had not set us up to starve in the wildernesses of life. And it's very counter to the mindset of not just our culture, but many cultures across the globe, and also many cultures in the past, and I suspect will continue on in this way. It's hard to have the lens of faith to really see and believe that what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will take care of itself. Look at the lilies of the valley, the sparrows in the field. I care more about you than the flowers and the birds. Focus on today. And even in our Lord's Prayer, we pray for our daily bread. And that's a direct link to this story as well. The daily bread in the Lord's Prayer is a direct link. And it calls us to a different way of being in a community together. And it's not one that really exists in anywhere that I know. Like, I've never lived in a place like what these stories point us towards. You're muted, Sue.
That's because Jay's talking sometimes. You think about manna, and they were out there 40 years. Eventually they asked for meat. I imagine they boiled it, they fried it. They might have done a lot of other things with it. Maybe they had some herbs that they brought from Egypt that they put into it. But for 40 years, it was the same day after day after day. And I think in our world today, we don't think that way. God provided, but not with variety. And it just seems strange that. And did they eat 3 meals a day, or did they just eat 2 meals a day? They could only have the manna until the sun got warm, because manna went away, it melted. Did they just eat one meal a day?
Hmm.
A lot of questions about that manna.
I remember a Sunday school class where the teacher gave us some sort of white flaky something that was sweet, like honey crisp or something. I was trying to get us to imagine what it might have been like, but anything you can really think of would get old after a while, whatever it is, I would imagine.
Yeah, John doesn't eat the same thing the next day. If I fix something, there's leftovers, we're not eating it the next day. I'm lucky if maybe the third day he'd eat it again.
Really? John
Yeah.
would be in a sorry state in the
Yeah,
wilderness.
he'd be in trouble.
He would learn that he would learn to be grateful for what he had.
Yeah. And maybe that's it. Right?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, that they lived so long in oppression and not having what they needed to meet their needs, and they were working for next to nothing, that it would take time for them to adjust to being provided for adequately. Maybe not, as you said, without the variety, without the spice, without whatever, but they were provided for and they lived. But then they were turned into a world where there was an abundance.
Mm.
And it doesn't seem like for very long they carried over the idea that they shouldn't store things up and hoard, and then you started getting that social caste system again.
I know they say that, they were in slavery, but I have a hard time. I think in our society today, when we think slavery, we think of the South.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't believe this was the kind of slavery, similar perhaps, but it talked about they had their fish and their pomegranates and various varieties of food that they had to eat in Egypt. Plus the fact, don't forget, when they left Egypt, they brought animals with them.
Mm-hmm.
So they may have had other meat as well, or milk, or, I think the diet may not have been great, but I think it was at least adequate, from what I've read in the scripture. And then to go from that to manna, either 3 times a day or twice a day or whatever, had to be a real shocker.
That's true.
Mm-hmm.
That's true.
I was thinking too, if for 40 days you're provided, it took them a while to figure this out, that they were going to be provided this manna every day, and then to go into a land of and honey and all that, it seems like at that point they would be to the place where expecting to be fed all the time and not even want to go out and work to do anything.
Well, what it seems to
Would have a variety of food if.
Sorry, you were cutting in and out a little bit, but I heard the most of what you said, Janet.
Okay.
It seems that when they got there, it seems as though that they used the land. The manna stopped, and so then they started using the land, as you would understand, as most reasonable people would imagine they would. And they would have the opposite of what we're discussing now. They would have options. They could choose to harvest, to plant or harvest a variety of things or collect different sorts of things. It wouldn't be at all like what we have today, where you could go to McDonald's and select between 40 different soft drinks. Wouldn't be like that. But it would have been more than the tedious, monotonous manna and then the quail meat in repetition. They don't seem to. It never said that they learned laziness by way of that. Learning to rely on manna. The risk seems to be the other side, where they will be hoard and to produce and out of resort to the same practices that they had observed in Pharaoh's Egypt, and that's why they're always called to go back and to remember the lessons learned in the wilderness and to remember how bad it was in Egypt. And just as it is with all of these lessons, the people, the people, Christians today or Israelites back then, we never live into the full vision laid before us. It's never happened. There's times where we relearn the lesson. So I'm thinking of like after the Great Depression in our country and how the people who lived through the Great Depression thought about their resources and how far things could go. And my grandparents continued to live in the shadow of the Depression. And I remember going to the grocery store with my grandma, and we would always go to the back and she would ask for the meat that was getting thrown out. And she carried on with these practices. Like I remember she would cook up some like meatloaf or something and it would look sort of gray and smell weird, but then she'd cook it and spice it up and it tasted fine, you know, but that was the mindset she carried to her grave. But she was always grateful, and you never got the impression that she felt like she were poor.
Mm-hmm.
But you fast forward to my generation, and I would say basically baby boomers and down, not just mine, we have gotten so used to convenience and access to a wide variety of resources that I feel like, oh, there goes Janet, that we may have forgotten the lessons learned again during, say, the Great Depression, which I'm reminded of the way that the Israelites would think back to Egypt when they're in exile in Babylon, where they found themselves having lost the land of milk and honey and displaced yet again, and coming to a realization that they had lost their way and forgotten the lessons.
Well, and those are the hard things that are hard to pass down. You remember your grandmother and shopping with her, but you don't carry through with that. You don't go to the back of the store and ask for what's going to be thrown out. So it doesn't get passed along that way. And, you know, for the words, remember when. Well, that only goes so far, because then you're into a generation that doesn't remember except by storytelling. And eventually the storytelling loses its punch.
Human. Go ahead,
This
Sue.
isn't exactly manna, but story comes to my mind as we're talking about. I've heard of a missionary that had come back from, I think, Africa, and went into the grocery store and saw the aisle of all the potato chips, the many flavors, the many sizes, everything, and was just astounded by how many varieties of potato chips are. And then their heart was saddened because there was so much here and so little there.
Mm-hmm.
And is that what happened when they went into Canaan? Did they just have the manna in the desert, and then when they went in and found the plenty from the land of Canaan, and it was there? You know, they kicked the people out, so the vineyards were there, and the fruit was on the tree, and things were growing, and they had to go pick it, but they had to pick up the manna too. So I don't know. It's a hard deal.
When you were describing that, I was wondering if like that isn't one sort of example of manna rotting and growing worms. Bags of potato chips in a it's just like while people are in other places don't have access to eat, that's low quality food there. I mean, it's very
that's what we get. That's what we get from gleaners. We get what was cleared out of the grocery stores because they're getting new product in with a more current expiration date or use by date. You know,
and gleaners is a bit of that principle in today's story kicking in, where people are like, we can't let the worms get this. We've got to get it to where it's needed before not sundown, but, you know, metaphorically, you know, before it's too late. And that's exactly it. And these stories, whether it's Jesus breaking bread or the manna in the desert, are meant to convict us to consider the ways that the places in our culture where food is rotting on the vine, resources are rotting on the vine, and how we can make sure that it gets to where it needs to go before it goes bad, or
And then-
before.
That's why at the food pantry, now that we're back to the distribution table, well, we were doing it when we were pre-bagging too, was every single week to get rid of all of the produce because it wasn't going to last another week.
Mm.
And if we had enough at the end, we would just tell people, give it to a friend, give it to a neighbor, please give it to somebody because we're giving you extra.
As I said at the beginning, I meant what I said. I've always find myself frustrated preaching passages like this, not because we don't all get the point. We all get, everyone, I feel like in this space we were talking, we understand, we see the problem, but will I get anxious about resources? And will I feel relieved if I have more in savings? And will I, say we're in a church meeting and we're talking about resources and we're anxious maybe about the perceived lack of money or tithe or whatever. Will I share the anxiety in the room that assumes an outlook of scarcity? I do. I believe one thing is true. I believe that God provides. I believe I shouldn't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will take care of itself. And yet I do. I worry about tomorrow. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes the Holy Spirit and the magic of the words soothe my spirit. And I think this is part of my conversion experience. Part of what it means for me to become a disciple of Jesus as I walk with Jesus is I'm always getting better. But I just be the first to own that I have not, we never really arrived. But as I said, my experience of preaching stories like this is similar in that I'll say it to not our church, any place I'm at, my last church, this church, and we will all agree that we ought to trust in God's providence in our lives, and to stretch what we have to be blessings to others. An anecdotal story from my childhood church where I think remember feeling the disconnection here, was I remember that I was allowed to sit in on board meetings. What kind of kid wants to sit on board meetings? But I would rather, I guess, have done that than just sort of bide my time, I don't know, in the hallway or wherever I was made to wait. So, and I remember there was a discussion about a certain church fund, where it was, I forget how many thousands of dollars, but throughout my entire youth and into my college years, the only time that money was discussed was what should we do with it? And they never did anything with it. When I left, they never did anything with it. I think more than a decade, it was just like an old business item on the minutes about what to do with this fund that somebody left with no designation. And there was a fear of spending it because then we don't have it. But then there's all of these ideas that we could put it towards, but then there was disagreement about what to do with it. And so what did it do? Use the analogy of food rotting on the vine. It sat in a digital bank account doing no good. And I remember when it really hit home was when I was back in my home church as an intern, when I was getting my minister's degree, my Christian ministries degree at Indiana Wesleyan. And I spent a summer as an intern at my home church. And I just remember sitting with that and hearing the pastor's frustration about it. And that was a very formative conversation. And I thought that I would leave that church of my youth, and then become a part of another community that thought differently, or that I myself would think differently. But what I've learned is these ways of thinking of resources are so ingrained in our culture and in us, being shaped by our culture, that it's really hard to untangle our anxieties and our assumptions about how money works and to reorient it in light of what we learn by our faith and by the gospel.
Surprise, we're all alike.
COVID and, for that matter, if weather gets bad, one would say we're going to have so much snow, and the doors crash because people have to have the things they really like, and rather than what they really need. And it goes crazy. And then people who want to go and get something, it's all gone, like
Toilet paper. It's part of the
paper. Exactly. Uh-huh.
That's a great example because there are times where there's a lack of a specific resource in a specific geographical region that but in that specific instance, there was enough toilet paper to go around, right? But for some reason that's another example. Just it's a sillier one we can laugh about because the stakes aren't very high. You could find something, toilet paper. But that's happening all the time with other resources that are essential for survival.
Baby formula.
I saw a card. It was like later and said, we're finally getting rid of the toilet paper. It was that we finally finished all for COVID. Yeah.
Say that again. Sorry, you were breaking up in the middle of the punchline.
Breaking up again.
Yeah.
So this cartoon where the man is life 10 years later. Oh, we finally are now finishing the COVID toilet paper that we got. Like they had 10 years.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm one of those people, when it's on sale, I buy it.
Mhm.
So when this happened, I didn't need to buy toilet paper. I already had it because I just buy it when it's on sale.
Well, keep the Jones family in your prayers in the coming days. We're right at that. I have no symptoms. I haven't tested positive. I'm going to keep testing myself. I'm going to be wearing a mask on Sunday. If I do test positive, you're supposed to give 5 days of isolation and then 5 days beyond that of wearing a mask and things like that. I'm just praying that my test comes back negative because the need to readjust quickly on a Friday or Saturday just seems overwhelming to me. So I'm hoping, we'll be good to go on Sunday. I'll be wearing a mask, but pray for my family because it's very stressful to sit in the anxiety and the lack of what our next several days are going to look like. Mm-hmm. And of course, I'm assuming that we're all going to be relatively healthy with COVID too. So pray that that's true as well. And just pray for my house because, this is just one compounding factor in the backswell of all of the grief that's still here. And
have you made any decisions about?
It looks like it's going to be all the way in August, if you can believe that, because that's all of the relatives have different things that they just can't, different responsibilities they can't just pick up and make a quick trip. So
that's what makes this good, that we can do this now, whereas before it wasn't always something that you could work in.
I'm relieved that we have more time to plan. That'll be better for my family's logistically, but I also feel like we need to have this service to get to the next stage of our
grief.
Grief.
Definitely. Mm-hmm.
And since it's all the way in August, it just feels like it's delaying this all.
Yeah.
But maybe we'll feel better come July and then, revisit it in August. I don't know how it'll, Janet and I have talked quite a bit about this, that you can't really plan or schedule how you grieve. It just happens to you.
Yeah, that's true.
So, prayers for us.
And sometimes when you have, my mother passed away when I was 31, but yet there are times that my eyes still fill with tears. I've been living longer than I lived with her. And even though that number of years, I still have that. The grief, it's just a moment, a connection to the past.
Sometimes you don't even know what triggered it.
Yeah.
Just happens.
Well, there are a couple of songs.
Oh yeah.
If the mood that I'm in, I could very, very easily have a moment then. So,
Me too.
but,
Kelly had a trigger earlier today. I mean, she's right in the thick of it, but we talk about odd things you wouldn't think. When June's COVID test came back, her impulse would have been to let everyone know, including her mother. And when it occurred to her as the next number to call on the list of people, she teared up because that was like, the first thought was like, oh, next mom.
Yeah,
Oh,
I know.
No.
I have that feeling. I called my mother every morning and night. So when she passed, it was a big change for me. No calls.
Hmm.
No, she was alone. She was living alone. And so I called to make sure she was up and going in the morning and in the evening to be sure she was ready to go to bed.
I've been going to this grief workshop and I've really gotten a lot of good out of it. It just says grief is never over. You always have it. And these things you're talking about, they call it being ambushed. You might be in the store and suddenly something, you see something on the shelf that your loved one really liked or something, and the tears just flow. It's just like you don't know it's coming, but it comes. And so you can handle that problem.
Being ambushed. I had not heard that before, but that's perfect way to describe it.
It is.
It's better way. I've been saying the words, it just happens to you, but it does feel like an invasion of your time and space. It just, we find ourselves saying, I'm sorry, it's just this thing, I'll get over in a second. Well, thank you for, I will say it again. I've said it from the pulpit. I will say it again too, is you all have been so good to my family through this time and understanding and concerned. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart. And we're just wanting to verbalize, we're still in it. And this COVID thing, I think is just, hopefully we're not one of those families that has it for a sustained period of time. That does happen too. The family that June caught it from seems to be that way. So I'm hoping that we have a different experience than they're having.
She's had shots, right?
She's had shots. And so, and her symptoms are manifesting, and theirs have too. They have been, as a family, the family that they have been feeling fine. I mean, a little sick now and again, a little tired, but basically fine. And they've all had their shots too, but they continue to have positive tests, a week and a half out. And so in fact, when we went to go get our tests, just to give June a break, we dropped her off at their house because they figured, hey, we all have it here. Like, so she's playing with her friend right now. She's having a fine time, honestly. It's more our inability to plan for the next week is what's making me feel anxious. But thank you for this time together. I'll see you next week, 2:00, chapter 3. And if you need me for anything, give a call. If you're all interested in going, I'll announce this on Sunday, but if there's interested in going to Joanne Fox's funeral, I don't know if you are or not, but that's at 10:30 at Washington Park North Cemetery.
On what day?
On Wednesday at 10:30. It's going to be in the mausoleum there. The whole thing's going to happen there. It's a very short service. I have eulogy, an a cappella song, some scripture reading. We don't anticipate there being a lot of people because she outlived her community by and large. She had one daughter.
Yeah.
So not a large family.
No, they're coming from Kansas City.
Oh, okay.
That's where she was.
Okay.
Well, you all take care.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
See you soon.
Oh.
Bye.
There.
Okay, bye, bye,
Bye, Janet.
Bye.
bye.